Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Education Select Committee evidence session on reform of Level 3 qualifications. I'm grateful to our witnesses for attending the committee this morning. Can I first of all just invite members to put on record any interest that you'd like to declare? Serena.
I'd like to declare that I have been a member of ASCL, but I am no longer a member of that association.
Thanks very much, Serena. Anybody else? No, in which case, can I invite our witnesses this morning to introduce yourselves, first of all, perhaps starting with Catherine at the end there.
Hello, good morning. I'm Catherine Cezanne. I'm Director of Education Policy at the Association of Colleges.
Good morning, I'm James Kewen. I'm the Deputy Chief Exec at the Sixth Form Colleges Association, and we also coordinate the Protect Student Choice, Don't Scrap BTECs campaign.
Hello, I'm Ruth Perry. I'm Senior Policy Manager at NatSpec, which is the membership body for specialist colleges where all the students have special education needs, disabilities.
Morning everybody, I'm Simon Cook. I'm the Principal Chief Exec of Mid Kent College, and I'm here today as the FE Committee representative for the Association of School and College Leaders.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. You have all, as organisations, broadly welcomed the government's decision to pause and review the removal of funding from a number of Level 3 qualifications, but you've also expressed concern about the scope and timing of the review. What impact has the government's review had on schools, colleges, teachers and students? Perhaps we could go in the opposite direction this time around, starting with Simon.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, I can expand further and give you lots of detail. I think if I was to simplify the answer to the question, it's uncertainty. An uncertainty that creates instability in a part of our education system that in this current era is so crucial to our future prosperity as a country, particularly within the college sector, where we are delivering vocational qualifications that directly impact on employers who are going to be part of our economic powerhouse. The uncertainty creates uncertainty for them, for young people and for parents, and that instability is creating the uncertainty.
Thank you. Ruth.
Right. I haven't got a great deal to add there to what Simon said. Specialist colleges, we don't actually have any that offer T Levels, but we work in partnership with General FE colleges with some subcontracting arrangements. And again, it's uncertainty, so those colleges haven't been able to say what their Level 3 offer will look like, and therefore what of that our students in specialist colleges will be able to tap into. So difficulty in planning.
Thank you. James.
I would agree with all of that. I think it's also hard to understate how disappointing this was as well, given that in opposition the Labour Party agreed to pause and review. And so it's hard to understate how much kind of hope that gave people when that commitment was made. It really was a game changer. But equally, unfortunately, it's hard to overstate how much disappointment there was when actually we found out in early July or late July, it was a kind of really sort of compromised pause and review. Instead of pausing the defunding of AGQs that's due for next year and the year after, actually the pause only applied to a very small number of technical qualifications that were due to go anyway. So I think that it's important to put that on record, the kind of sense of hope that was kind of dashed as a result of the announcement. And then things have changed even since the review was confirmed, because originally it was all Level 3 qualifications and below, then it was just Level 3, then it was the Level 3 qualifications due to go next month. And we don't expect to get all the answers next week. We understand that the results of the review are due next week, but I think we're concerned that, to Simon's point, there could still be uncertainty next week. So I think overall the picture is uncertainty is the main concern, I think.
Thank you. Catherine.
A lot of what everybody has already said. I mean, we were pleased that the Secretary of State acted so swiftly, because it is a key issue for colleges because of that lack of clarity. But I would emphasise that this point about the fact that it is only a certain number of qualifications that are being reviewed, and we believe that other Level 3 qualifications, and indeed Level 2 and below, which is also really important for our students, will be reviewed through the Curriculum and Assessment Review, but it's that lack of clarity. I think it would be really good to have clear messages on timelines and where we're going.
Thank you. So given what you've all said, would anybody like to comment on what immediate steps the government should be taking to ensure that students have confidence in the availability of qualifications for the coming year?
I mean, I don't mind starting on that because we provided a kind of short no. I mean, we are where we are. It is disappointing, but we're in the kind of, I guess all of us in the solutions business and want to get to the right place. So what we have recommended is we focused on 21 applied general qualifications that are high enrolment, very popular, very important to the economy, very important for social mobility. And our message is these qualifications must stay. These are the kind of red lines. We're talking extended diploma in health and social care, we're talking applied science. These are kind of vital qualifications. So that's the first point. The second point is that they have to stay for 2 years. Again, to the point on uncertainty, what we don't want is confirmation of qualifications next week, but only for a year, because we're in this uncertainty loop again. So we need to have at least 2 years of certainty on these qualifications. And thirdly, the previous government introduced these kind of rather bizarre rules of combination that said, well, you can't combine an A-level in this with 2 BTECs and that, or 2 BTECs and that, and an A-level and that. And our very clear message is that just doesn't work. I don't think any government would apply those to A-levels. So they shouldn't apply them to apply qualifications as well. So in summary, I think we provided a really kind of clear way out of this, and we really hope the government takes it.
Thank you. Anyone else want to
come in? Happy to just add a bit more. I think, look, we are in a very unique period, and as I think this government is fully aware of with the announcements of the youth guarantee offers in the last couple of weeks, we are seeing some worrying numbers around young people who are classified as NEET, a horrible phrase to be defined by. The population of post-16 is going to grow over the next few years, so reducing qualification choice is going to exacerbate that issue. For me, as much as I know it's a very short timescale and I've agreed with the points that have been previously made, it's not an ideal world, we are where we are, but removing qualifications is going to make matters even worse than the current situation. So what would I prefer? I would prefer us to retain a duality of approach, particularly around T Levels and BTEC qualifications. I'm a huge advocate for T Levels, but I also know full well in my own organisation that they are not working for everybody for various different reasons, and I'll probably get the opportunity to expand on that later. So keeping and retaining as opposed to removing qualifications in this current period is ever more crucial.
Thank you, Ruth.
Colleagues have spoken about some specifics, but it would be really helpful, I think, to get some general messages that go beyond the specific from this pause and review. I think we would like to hear very firmly that overlap in terms of content is definitely not a criterion for removal of qualifications, so where they overlap with T Levels. I think we want to have a commitment to ongoing funding of applied general qualifications, certainly in the medium term. And while that's happening, that there is some focused evaluation of T Levels in terms of whose needs can they meet. So we have concerns that there are large numbers of students with SEND for whom T Levels aren't suitable. We'd like to see their effectiveness monitored. Without that, I think we risk losing a tried and tested progression route to HE for learners with SEND that the BTECs offer at the moment. And finally, I would like to see government indicate that this was stage one in a more fundamental review of the previous government's reforms, plans for the reforms. We've heard nothing, for example, about what's happening level 2 and below, particularly in terms of the personal and social employability skills qualifications, major consultation on that. Never even heard the outcomes from government about it. So we'd like to, firm commitment that this is just part of a review.
Thank you. Catherine, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, the thing I wanted to mention was actually level 3 technicals. So in addition to the applied general qualifications are really key qualifications in sectors where we're desperate to make sure that we're filling those skills gaps. So things like electrical and on-site construction. T level is not going to suit the needs of everyone. We need to make sure that we've got qualifications that meet students' starting points and also stepping off points. So it's really crucial that we also consider those qualifications as well.
Thank you. And from your perspective, could you tell the committee what would good look like? We expect, as you've mentioned, we're expecting the outcome of the review imminently. What would it mean for the review? What would be the content of the review that you would have confidence in as a starting point for moving forward?
I think I would say that it was the recommendations we outlined earlier. So a yes to those three would be a massive step forward away from uncertainty as well, and would keep some really important qualifications. I think the concern we still have, though, is that the majority of qualifications, so the first wave of defunding is due for next year. The second wave is the year after. There's actually significantly more qualifications in scope for defunding the following year. So I think that even if we do get certainty next week about these qualifications, and we get that 2-year certainty, which would be great, we will very quickly then move into some of the really, really big enrolment subjects the following year as well. So the government needs to move really quickly, and it's not really good enough to say, as they've suggested, this is a matter for the wider curriculum and assessment review. This is something they need to address urgently.
Anyone else want to come in on
Yeah,
that?
it's the point about clear timelines. So we've been through periods of reform over the past 10 years. So we had diplomas, we had QCF, we've had T Levels, we've had qualification reform, and for the post-16 part of the sector, it's very disruptive, the lack of clarity, and it also impacts on key stakeholders, so parents, carers and employers. They really struggle to understand the landscape. So clear plans for the next few years so that we can provide that clarity to our stakeholders as much as our staff would be really good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, I go back to the point I made right at the very beginning. What would good look like? Good would look like a level of certainty as opposed to the uncertainty. I'll give you an example. As are thousands of schools and colleges going through series of open events with parents and young people, and the common questions from parents and young people are these qualifications going to be here next year? That's an incredibly nervous and anxious time for so many young people making choices that they believe will set their future, and so the uncertainty for them and for us being removed would be, in this first step, really good. The reality is, though, that this is a huge piece of work that needs unravelling. So there's going to be a large amount of uncertainty still going forward that I suspect will go into the curriculum and assessment review, which will take longer. But specifically around the pause and review for level 3, taking away that uncertainty and giving some certainty around what is going to be funded going forward. There are a number of colleges who have already modelled the level 3 defunding as was before the pause and review, a number of whom will be facing uncertainty in terms of becoming insolvent through the reduction of student numbers by 2027 for some, 2028 for others. That uncertainty is far deeper in those organisations. So I think knowing that there's some certainty around those qualifications that were proposed to be defunded would certainly help many of those organisations and their young people, parents and employers.
Just in summary, really, I think the clarity around the specifics, so those qualifications that have got sort of Damocles hanging over them, knowing exactly what is going to happen with those is one part of it, but also setting that future direction for travel. So we would be very pleased to have a firm signalling that there is a continued place for applied general qualifications.
Thank you. Before I pass the baton to other colleagues to ask some questions going into a bit more detail, would you be able to tell the committee just really briefly what engagement you've had with the department over the review?
We've had quite a lot of engagement. So there were opportunities for over 100 colleges to engage on a route-by-route basis, looking at specific qualifications in those routes, which we said we thought was a really good way forward, because the problem is the moment we have a one-size framework that's supposed to meet all sectors are really different. We've also had opportunities for college principals and CEOs to meet with the team members as well, which we appreciated, and we know that was also appreciated by our members.
Yes, and I think the review team deserve credit for this. They were given an impossible job, frankly, to do at the DFE, and I think the team looking after this have been as open as they can be with it. But I suppose the bigger issue for me is that it's inconceivable that any government would review every A-level in 3 months, behind closed doors, not publish terms of reference, have no consultation mechanism, and then tell schools and colleges at Christmas what A-levels they can deliver the following year. That just wouldn't happen. So I think there is a double standard here as well. So I think the team itself has done a great job, but it should never have been done in this way.
Thank you.
We've
please.
had more limited contact, but that's in the nature of the provisions. The colleges don't offer T levels themselves, but NatSpec has contributed to a round table.
Yeah, as colleagues have already said, been part of the participation. I think, look, let's. The reality is, I know I'm fortunate enough that a number of colleagues in the department have come to visit the organisation to see how the policy applies in practice. And it reminds me every time that this is a really impossible task for some. Actually, it's a huge task and a huge piece of work that needs unravelling. So I think the more we can work with colleagues in the department to help unravel the challenges we've got, the more I think it will help. I think if there's one thing that it proves to me is that the approach of one size fitting everybody just simply doesn't work. And I think fundamentally that's what this policy has become or became. And one size definitely doesn't fit all. That's both geographically, as well as employers, and as well as young people and adults who are looking at programmes.
Thank you very much. Serena.
Thank you, Chair. So my question on the reform of Level 3 qualifications will help you build on some of the specifics and the issues that you've shared with the committee this morning. So there have been calls for the government to pause defunding of all applied general qualifications until 2027. What would this look like in terms of benefits for students and providers, and how will the defunding of AGQs, applied general qualifications, affect different types of FE providers? So, Catherine?
Yeah, I'll kick off on this one. So I think it is the point about clarity, and going back to the point I made previously, that we've been through periods of reform. So we obviously now have the curriculum and assessment review, which for Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 4 is something quite novel and new and exciting. And I think it is also for colleges, don't get me wrong. But we've equally been through a period of reform over many years. And so actually to say, right, we're going to take time, we're going to step back, and we are going to come up with a system which then we are not going to change again for another 20, 30 years, because obviously we realise that there always needs to be change. But I think it's that consistency, that certainty, and going back to James's point, that people know what they're delivering, and that our key stakeholders know as well what they're going to be coming to college to do, and for employers as well. So I think that's really important. But I would add that it's not just about AGQs. It is also about those technical qualifications in the technical space, which are really important as well. Maybe smaller numbers, but they're really important, particularly things like electrical. We really need those young people to be going on to be successful.
I think it would be a game changer. If we could get this over the line next week, it really would help institutions. And when I go back in time, I made the point at the beginning, it was a Protect Student Choice campaign that back in June 23 secured the commitment for the government to pause and review, or the opposition as they were then. And we set out a pretty detailed implementation plan at the beginning of this year about how that could actually operate in practice. And all the way through, we've said the timing is really important. So getting the right qualifications, and we've identified, and our campaign, as Kath rightly says, all the qualifications are available. We're focused on the applied qualifications because they've had a particularly torrid time under the last government. So we've picked the qualifications that we think would have the biggest impact. But I think for it to be a game changer, we need that certainty over time. So apologies to sound a bit like a broken record, but we need that 2-year certainty. But I think even then, my final point, there's something even more fundamental that needs to be addressed. What's kind of bedeviled the campaign and bedeviled this area since 2019 is this view, which I'm sure we'll come on to, is that T levels are essentially a kind of upgraded version of applied general qualifications. And I think that until that is addressed, and until a small number of influential people are still pushing this view, and until we get a clarity that actually they're different qualifications that serve a different purpose, and we need to retain the 3-route model of academic, applied and T levels, this is going to come back. We're going to have this conversation again and again and again. So rather than just being a state of execution, we'd actually rather this more fundamental conversation happen so we can stop going around these same houses.
I would agree pretty much entirely with what James has just said there. But I think for us as well, the opportunity to use a period in which these qualifications are retained to do a proper fundamental evaluation of T levels to determine whether they are accessible and appropriate for a full range of learners. I'm thinking particularly of learners with SEND, but also different types of disadvantage. I know you're talking to the Education Policy Institute next, but their report shows that learners with SEND are definitely underrepresented on T levels. They also show that the dropout rate is higher for learners who are disadvantaged, and that a third of those who drop out go on to be NEET. We really don't need anyone else falling into that NEET category when we have perfectly good provision at the moment that we could be offering them. To have that taken away would be really it just seems illogical to do that. So using the period to understand better who T levels can serve, I think also to look how much more accessible they can be made, because I think while they're not the right option for many learners with SEND, they're certainly the right option for some, but the inflexibility of the structure of them at the moment and the assessment methodology, we could also use that period to be looking at how we could make them more accessible.
Look, I think, again, I'm going to be the broken record that keeps talking about uncertainty, and I think, let me just give you a couple of examples just to explain why, for the benefit of the committee. A-levels are a known brand. They've been around since the early 50s, haven't really changed much since the 50s. GCSEs are known by most people, been around since 1988. I was one of the very first people to sit a GCSE in 1988, all those years ago. They haven't really changed that much. A few years ago, we changed the grading of GCSEs from letters to numbers. I'm sure you're all very well versed on the equivalency of letters and numbers. Most parents still ask, what does the difference mean? Yet in that period, just since 2020, the amount of reforms that we've seen in further education and post-16 provision are mind-blowing. That creates uncertainty and instability. So if I go back to some of the areas, Kath talked about them, James has talked about them, I've got staff, I've got students, I've got employers in key areas of our economy where they have simple uncertainty around what the future is. I've got students and staff delivering subjects like public services, electrical, plumbing, e-sports, all of which are having a profound impact on our economy, on our young people, on reducing NEET numbers, on helping improve employability prospects. None of those qualifications have got certainty that they're going to be around. Now, I can be much better at my crystal ball gazing if I want to be, but it's crystal ball gazing. So I'm basing most of my planning in 18 months and beyond on whether I've got the best guess possible on what may or may not happen. And that uncertainty is incredibly risky when I'm stewarding and accountable for stewarding a significant amount of public money.
And I was just wondering whether anybody would like to come back with a little bit of further information on possibly the impact that this could have. As Ruth said, you mentioned about student dropout and retention across technical subjects as well as ADQs. Do you feel that the defunding pause until 2027 would support students to have more informed, guided choices and to make better decisions?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, Kath, after you, Kath.
Yes. So particularly for students, so we know that in colleges, 60% of students who are on level 3 qualifications start at either 17 or 18. So they have done a level 1 and or a level 2 at 16 and progress. And those students often are students who have lower grade entry GCSEs. They often come from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and they often have additional needs. So about 33% of students at colleges in level 2 have additional needs. So in order to make sure that we've got the clarity and we can make sure that we've got options for all students, not just some students, and particularly we were talking outside about the rising NEET figures, so we want to make sure that we are having a positive impact on that, and we're doing the best that we can to engage our young people.
Thank you.
I'll bring in Darren next. Thank you.
Morning. Since the government launched its review, the Skills Minister, Baroness Smith, has said that some of the level 3 qualifications will remain, even if there is some overlap between them and the T levels. The criteria she's put on it is where the balance of learner and employer needs within a sector requires them. I wonder if I could get your comments on how that can be judged, that balance between learner and employer needs, and who should be doing that judging.
Could I just say something just to preface that as well, which is that I think that it's interesting to compare this government's position with the previous governments on this particular issue. And I suppose the really fundamental issue we had with the previous government is that it saw a world of A levels and T levels. It saw essentially a two-route model with other qualifications approved by exception. So when the new government came in and the new minister started talking in this kind of way, I think it's maybe a bit less dogmatic than the previous government. However, they're still starting from the wrong place. So if you look through the rest of Jackie Smith's remarks there, she talks about qualifications that sit alongside A levels and T levels. And that's still the wrong starting point. That shouldn't be where the debate begins. What we need is a three-route model and ensuring there are high-quality qualifications within each. The trap the last government fell into, in my view, is that driving up T-level numbers, the output became more important than the outcome, which is making sure every young person had a high-quality qualification to pursue. And frankly, although we're all supporters of T-levels, and I'm sure we'll come to this, everybody wants T-levels to succeed, but frankly, they don't merit being one of the first two names on the team sheet. These are qualifications that have a significantly higher dropout rate than AGQs. They have a lower pass rate. They have much lower student satisfaction. The T-level transition program, 92% of young people don't progress onto a T-level. So T-levels need help and support. They're not in a position yet, in our view, and certainly in the campaign's view, to be the first two names there alongside A-levels. So there is something, I think, really fundamental, Darren, about your question around where we begin before we then get into the deciding which qualifications survive.
No, that's helpful.
Yeah. I'd like to make a point about overlap. I think overlap is being seen as overlap in terms of content, but actually that's just one part of it. So applied general qualifications offer a different approach, a different assessment methodology, different sizes of qualification. They belong to multi-level, multi-size qualification families that provide progression routes from level 1 through to level 3. So they're a very different beast. So I think that's what James is saying, really, that we can't look at it as an either or. The differential isn't just content. So the fact that they overlap in terms of some of their content shouldn't be a major factor in whether we have an applied general qualification in that area or not.
Yeah, look, I think some of the approach around where it's right has been pretty obvious. I think student numbers, enrolments have been a helpful guide. They've shown popularity. Agree to the point that James just made. What we mustn't do is think that there is just one size fits all. This isn't about T-levels versus everything else. Actually, I'm a huge advocate for how T-levels have worked for a proportion of our young people and our employers. It's transformed our relationship with primary care NHS trusts, for example, which AGQs alone weren't able to do. But being able to offer both T-levels and AGQs in the area of health is helping young people to progress and gain employment, plus at the same time significantly enhancing and improving our direct impact on employment prospects for organisations like the NHS. I can take a different suite of qualifications and say it works in opposite to that example. So I think there's both local variances as well as qualification variances and industry areas as well that are quite different. So again, one size won't fit all, but I think if we look at student numbers, if we look at what works in a particular area or in a particular employment sector, it starts to help us identify how these dual approaches might be a better solution in the short term than just one or the other.
I think it's also more than the qualification. I think the importance of triangulation between providers, employers, government, we've lacked that over the past few years, so that we can look about things that actually are going to work on the ground. But there are other challenges. We have foundational challenges in terms of funding and staffing as well. And then finally, I would say information, advice and guidance. So we're making sure that we're getting students on the right courses at the right time, courses which meet their needs. So I think it's actually taking all of those things together. Now that's huge, and it goes back to James's point about trying to achieve that in a 3-month period is quite difficult. But going forward, I think greater collaboration and the idea of social partnership hopefully will help us to enable to get to a place where we are being able to meet the needs of employers, but we're also meeting the needs of young people and our adult learners as well.
Caroline, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, to what extent do these AGQs contain work placements, and are there any particular difficulties at the moment in obtaining those work placements?
So in terms of AGQs, not that many AGQs contain work placements. We do have qualifications, for example, like education childcare, which has always traditionally included a large work placement, and it's very much embedded within that sector. There are also some qualifications in areas in land-based industries which require placements, and students are required as part of their study programme to do work experience. It is quite tricky. It takes a lot of work and effort. It is a great opportunity for young people to be able to engage in employment, because it's a very different landscape from when I was growing up and we were out, doing a paper round or something when you were 12. That's quite different now. And so it's a real opportunity, and I think we'd like to see more opportunities for young people to get out to do placements. But does that answer your question, Caroline?
Are they paid?
No.
They're not paid.
No, they're not paid.
Anybody else want to come in on that?
You've asked a question about placements around AGQs, so it gives me a perfect opportunity to talk about industrial placements for the T levels. So forgive my poetic license on that one, but look, that is the really singular positive impact of T levels, the industrial placements. But if I looked at a world that just had T levels with the industrial placement component, then I would, in my region, struggle to recruit enough employers. I gave you the example earlier on around T levels in health and how that single-handedly helped transform our relationship with primary care trusts, helping them to solve their recruitment challenge and helping us get young people to consider careers in the NHS that they perhaps never thought of before. That's really important, and that's great because we've got some huge employers across the NHS.
Do they get paid?
They don't get paid, no at all. And it's taken us probably, by working in collaboration in our particular region with 2 other colleges, we've worked in collaboration, and our huge success is convincing the NHS it's okay to have anybody under 18 in clinical roles, which takes a lot of convincing. You don't just turn up to an employer and they say, yeah, we're desperate to take loads of people on. The larger your small and micro business landscape in a community, the harder that is. So an NHS organisation has got a huge infrastructure behind it to help. We have a huge density of small businesses. That's incredibly difficult to ask them to take on volunteers and unpaid volunteers who are learning as they go. So that requires a great deal of effort and work. And in other sectors, it doesn't work so well. Construction, for example, for us, our T-level in construction has been incredibly difficult to get enough employers willing to take on industrial placements. So, again, it goes back to what I said earlier about one size just doesn't fit all across our whole economy and our whole country. Where students get exposure to the world of work whilst they're studying, that's excellent and it's brilliant. And that only helps them build self-esteem, confidence, and the skills that will help them transition into work. The industrial placements have led to so many young people being offered employment whilst they are working for that employer. So they are a great thing where they take place.
If I may, just quickly,
If that's okay.
in terms of young people with special educational needs and disabilities, the advantage of the applied general qualification and work placement, as Kath says, it is a requirement of your funding contract as a provider, part of the study programme, that you must provide work placement, but it allows a provider to be very flexible in terms of meeting the individual needs and the capabilities, the stamina levels and so on of a young person with SEND. So rather than having a fixed proportion of the programme that must be made up of work placement, you're able to flex to be responsive to what a young person needs.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Mark now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Thanks for your answers so far. So qualifications such as BTECs will need to meet the new occupational and employer-approved criteria in order to be publicly funded from 2025. So I've got 3 questions, but I'll just start with 2. How effective do you think this approval process will be in actually streamlining the qualification options? And do you agree with the specifications in the criteria? Happy to start with anyone.
I think in terms of criteria, a little bit tricky because I'm personally not quite clear what the criteria is in terms of the fact that we know that overlap is no longer a criteria, for which we're grateful. But I think it goes back to that point about how you can identify which, in a short space of time, which qualifications are the qualifications of choice and those that are not. And I think it takes us back to that point about, in the ideal world, what would we like to see? So I think clarity about how the decisions have been made would be quite welcome as well when we actually get to that point.
Thank you.
Yeah, as Kath said, I think knowing fully, transparently what those criteria are, I think is really helpful. I'll give you a slightly different example here, I guess, and it's let's look at the impact of something that has gone through a similar process. And let me take apprenticeships. Everybody knows about apprenticeships, a really strong brand. Yet if we look at how apprenticeships are now compared to how they were a few years ago, take-up is nowhere near as much as we would like it to be. And most of our apprenticeship system has been coerced into a very different type of provision to the one that perhaps the intent was set. And what I mean by that is that when you have a very specific small group of individual organisations or groups determining qualifications, it's always going to be biased, isn't it? And therefore not meet everybody's need. I think we live in an era now where it's much more acknowledged and recognised that we have local differences and local nuances. And so I think we have a government at the moment who are looking much more closely at devolved powers and autonomy in local areas, and I think that has to be factored in. A national employer may well have lots more infrastructure and time to get involved in setting standards for a particular industry, but time and time again, as we've seen through the reform of apprenticeship standards, we still have employers that say, that standard doesn't fit my workplace, it doesn't fit what we do here in this industry. So I think we have a wider challenge within the skills landscape, don't we, around, and I don't have the answer for this, around how our industry convenes around setting standards that are consistent across the country, but also reflect local and particularly smaller businesses for whom that's much harder to reflect for.
Thank you.
Just like to log a concern about perhaps an over-emphasis on employer designing and decision-making in relation to qualifications. I absolutely understand the importance, the skills covered in qualifications need to match the skills that employers require, but they don't always have a good understanding of young people's starting points or how they learn, what motivates them, what they enjoy. And understandably as well, I think they can be very aspirational, but that makes them very inflexible. So I think that's why we have T levels that are so large in content terms, because employers have fought the corner to put everything in possible. An awful lot of it's mandatory. The more you create these rigid structures, the less accessible those qualifications are to a wide array of learners with different needs. So I think we should be cautious. I think across the whole of the qualification reform programme, we have probably tipped a little bit too far into responding to employer needs, forgetting to balance with young people's needs.
I think although I would add to that, I'd agree with everything Ruth just said. I think although the government has changed, we still have the infrastructure in place of the previous government. I mentioned earlier the fact that there's still the way the system is set up in terms of approval is still very much academic or technical. So the previous government sort of airbrushed the applied route out of existence. And I think that's still a bit of a concern for us. And we have this kind of, without getting too much into the weeds, because it is a horribly overcomplicated kind of system, I mentioned earlier the fact that the government is reviewing 500 qualifications behind closed doors. We also have a situation, a very early decision the government made wrongly in our view, was to continue with what are called alternative academic qualifications, so AAQs instead of AGQs. So even that name, the suggestion is who would want to do a qualification called an alternative? I mean, by definition, it's second best. And yet they're going to be in play. So in September next year, you will have, if we get these AGQs over the line still, that would be great. But we're going to have AGQs alongside AAQs in different sizes. So this was a completely avoidable situation if the government as promised in opposition, had this 2-year pause, because we would have had the time and space to work through not just what qualifications are here, but also iron out some of the complexity. I mean, AGQs have a slightly different approval process, but again, we are where we are. It's not where we wanted to be, but I think where we're going to end up is kind of incremental change, hopefully making sense of the system. But at some point, we need to have that fundamental review we've talked about are we going to have a 3-route system or what? And we think we absolutely need to have it.
That really nicely leads into my final question, Chair. So, James, you've identified 21 applied general qualifications, haven't you, at level 3, which you say are absolutely essential to retain. So how did you decide which qualifications needed to be retained and which we could dispense with?
It wasn't actually that hard in some respects, because there aren't that many of them.
Yeah.
So again, just a preliminary point. I think again, we used to hear a lot about how complicated the landscape is. The kind of students wandering around completely bamboozled by the number of qualifications, and actually there's more A levels than there are AGQs. So in total, there's only 134 AGQs anyway. In this first wave, there were 38. Many of them had low or no enrolments. So when you pick the ones that have the high enrolments, but also that meet, and we quite deliberately did this, meet the government's criteria about being necessary, have economic value, have value for students, so good track record in terms of progression to HE and so on as well. It was actually a relatively straightforward process, and these often are the kind of household names, health and social care, as I mentioned, applied science, the ones that are really, really important to keep. So, of course, other qualifications are available. We're focused on AGQs, and in this first wave, these were the ones that really have to stay.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Sorry, Catherine, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to, again, make the point that it's not just AGQs. So there are technical qualifications. So the concern about qualifications at level 3 in plumbing, electrical. So again, the smaller numbers, but those are really, really key sectors. But I would also emphasise looking at the numbers. So there's balance of provision as well within colleges, and balance of the type of learner as well. So that's also really important, bearing in mind what Ruth was saying about focusing on the learner as much as the employer.
Patrick, I'm going to bring you in now.
I've got the next question coming up, but I thought I just wanted to get one in on this subject. The premise of reform all those years ago was to simplify this system. James, you've just described an overcomplicated system, and yet we're sitting here and you are all arguing for the retention of an overcomplicated system. So how do we square that circle?
I think quite easily, because what I'm talking about is a system that we will see, not that we have now. So I think if you've got 5,000, I think it's 5,500 qualifications at level 3 and below. Of those 5,500, maybe 1,500 are level 3 themselves qualifications. And of those, only 134 are applied general qualifications. So I think what we're saying is that we have a very, very small number of well-established qualifications. What we've often heard from government, and even this government sometimes, is that there are too many qualifications in the firmament. And we would say that's true if you count all of them up, but we're not making the case to retain every single qualification. The other point I would make is that those 134, they are small in number, but they're extremely popular. So you've got 134 qualifications that at least 280,000 young people are studying. I think, as Simon was saying earlier, they're very well understood, they're well established, they work very well with A levels as well as being standalone qualifications. So we think where there is complexity, it's not in the applied space. You could make a case for saying actually the A level landscape is more cluttered because there's at least 100 more than there are AGQs. I think where there is complexity is more in the technical space, where there are multiple qualifications often in the same area. And our message has always been, by all means rationalise, by all means simplify things, but if you're looking at applied generals to do that, you're looking in the wrong place.
Thank you.
I mean, I was struck by what you said, that T levels wouldn't even get onto the team sheet if you're looking at the top 2, low dropout rates, low levels of satisfaction among students. So why are the AGQs so much more popular, and what can we do to get T levels to a point where students are getting the most from them?
I think fundamentally T levels are a minority product. And no amount of marketing a minority product will turn it into a mass market product. So T levels, I think, as we've always said, have a really, really important role to play. But as currently constructed, they don't serve a mass audience in the way that applied general qualifications do. They come in different sizes. You can combine them with different types of, with A levels and so on as well. So there are all sorts of reasons why the two qualifications serve a very different purpose. And I suppose, again, under the previous government, there was a very clear view that A levels and T levels would be the two qualifications of choice. And our view was always, as currently constructed, that was always a wildly unrealistic aspiration, because they're not fundamentally, they're not a mass market product. And the irony of all of this is that we saw some modifications announced only yesterday to T levels, is that the only way to make T levels into a mass market product like BTECs is make them all like BTECs, in which case why not just keep BTECs? So I think there is a clarity of purpose here. What are T levels for? They're currently for a very small number of young people, 26,000 versus 280,000. And we need to have that conversation about what is the target here, what is the aim of this group of young people that we want to see served by these qualifications. But fundamentally, we should not try to replace BTECs with T levels, because they are completely different in many respects, in many examples, completely different qualifications.
Sorry, I think you've got other witnesses who want to answer.
Sorry, Pat. To be honest, Patrick, I think the answer to your question is a whole new select committee on its own, really, because it actually, your question is it feels really simple, doesn't it? Actually, why can't we make T levels more accessible and better in order to replace the AGQs that exist? And I think to be able to fully really answer that question, you've got to look at the whole qualification structure and the whole education system in some way, shape or form, because I said earlier on, I'm a huge advocate for T levels. They work really well for a small number of young people. Since we've been doing T levels in my organisation, we've got about 213 students interested in T levels. It works for some students really well and perfect, but the AGQs work really well for students who cannot access T levels. One of the most significant barriers to T levels is the amount of assessment that takes place. A young person doing a T level is going to have to sit 40 hours of examinations. That's 40 hours in two lots of about 20 hours over two windows. That's a huge amount of work for a very specific young person that's going to need to have a very specific set of skills. I can't just pluck a young person off the street and then be ready for that without there being an immense amount of work beforehand over a number of years to allow that young person to access. That's before I talk about young people with SEND, where they might need even more support to be able to do so. So, one single barrier is sometimes the level of literacy and numeracy that those young people have got. If they haven't got the requisite grade 4s or better in English and maths, I know full well they're not going to be able to cope with 40 hours of examination. That makes a huge barrier to accessing T levels. Reputationally, just give you an example, since 2020 we've been running T levels, really successful, have about 220 students on T level programs. It's by far not the biggest and not the smallest across the post-16 sector, but in the last 2 years I've re-entered the A-level market, and already within 2 years I've got the same number of students doing A-levels. That's because in some parts of our community, A-levels are a trusted brand. They know what they're going to do, they know what they're going to get. T-levels are still, that magic U word I used at the beginning, uncertain, unclear, and for some young people and their parents don't want to choose that. So we have to change behaviours over a longer period of time, certainly not over a short period of time.
I would reiterate the point about assessment. In comparison with A-levels, the assessment is huge, but assessment is obviously based on content because we're looking at competency in a T-level, and I think perhaps that needs to be reviewed. So we definitely need to look at content and assessment if we want the T-level to be more accessible. And then it does take us back to the starting points of students as well. So we know that around 40% of young people don't achieve both English and maths at 16. And to ask a young person to go onto a T-level, which is already a large qualification with substantial amounts of assessment, also alongside that doing GCSEs in English and maths, is something that I personally wouldn't do. Having worked in a college, that wouldn't be appropriate information, advice or guidance for that young person. So I think there are a number of other factors that we have to look at, albeit lots of colleges are really positive about T levels, and in health, for example, they are working really well because they do provide that pipeline into a really important sector, because those students know that they want to go into nursing or allied healthcare. So I think it's also looking at it on a route by route basis, because in some sectors, digital as well, we've had quite a lot of enrolment in digital. Education early years, very popular in terms of T level. In fact, we've now got more students doing T level than we have legacy qualifications. So again, it goes back to the one size format doesn't fit all, and we need to look at it on a sector by sector basis.
I think my colleagues have made it very obvious why learners with SEND are not particularly attracted to T levels, the size, the amount of assessment, the style of assessment. I think another real factor, though, is in terms of size, you need to know at 16 where you're headed if you're going to pick a T level. And so many young people come into further education and they absolutely haven't a clue. They come in with a really checkered experience of school. They don't know what their skills are. They don't know what their strengths are, and they are they're not in a position to pick something that focuses them and channels them so clearly in one direction. Interestingly, we don't ask A-level students to do that. They pick a blend of things that give them multiple options for their next steps. But we're trying to funnel young people into a particular route, and most aren't in a position to make that choice.
Sorry, Chair, just to abuse my position for one more question. The whole issue is parity of esteem between an academic and a non-academic route. Is the purpose of T levels and alternative qualifications in colleges about providing an alternative to all children, or to children who are struggling in the kind of more traditional routes through education? Because the way you guys have presented it is very much we are trying to provide an alternative to children who might not succeed or haven't succeeded at school and aren't going on to HE. And I think this is really important. It's a principle that we have to establish in this country, whether we're trying to create a high quality alternative to academic qualifications like A-levels, or we're trying to find some way of keeping children in formal institutions until their 18th birthday.
And I urge relatively brief answers to this question as well, because we're running out of time.
It's a really good question. It's absolutely fundamental to the whole parity of STEAM debate. But I think what we have to get away from is that you can offer two very different high quality products. They don't have to be so similar. So if we make an assessment methodology that seems as hard or even harder than A-levels, we should be looking at what types of rigour are appropriate, fit for purpose for vocational options, rather than trying to impose one model onto the other.
Parity of esteem. There's another whole another hour as well, I guess. Look, we've done a lot. I think we collectively, as a country, have done a lot over the last few years to create parity of esteem. And I don't for one second suggest that we've not got it right. I think it takes a long time to challenge those. I would suggest that you don't get parity of esteem through qualification reform structure. What you get is you get that through how we all, through society, place value on qualifications. I say that as a young man who left school at 16, became a professional chef, went to work in Germany for 4 years. I know exactly how that feels, working as a professional chef in a different country. It's a social attitude toward parity of esteem. Qualifications are subsidiary to that, and I think it's important that we continue to message that value we place equally so on both qualifications, because over time that will permeate through our society and it will become a norm. So I wouldn't want us to give up on that, but it's not through qualifications that we will achieve that. That's my own personal view.
I need you to be super brief if there are any further answers to this.
I just think it's really important that we have a variety of qualifications. I'm sure all of you recently have been to a restaurant or have been to have your hair cut, or have needed a plumber, and you need someone who's competent. That's really important. They may not necessarily have they may not have the particular academic skills, but we require people with a variety of skills, and we, as Simon so eloquently said, we need to respect all of those and promote equal routes.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Manuela, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we already heard about some of the challenges and threat to the inclusivity of the post-16 education landscape, especially for SEND students. So the government has said it is committed to making A-levels and T levels the main further education qualification options at 16. What are the likely consequences of these for students with special educational needs and disabilities, and those as well with education, health and care plans?
I might kick off on that one as the SEND person on the panel. I think we are in danger of closing down options for these learners, and I think that's would be an unforgivable thing to do. The government made it clear in its own impact assessment from the original publication of its proposals that the learners most likely to be impacted were those with SEND and other types of disadvantage, but they also made the claim that they were likely most to benefit from the changes. As I said earlier, there's been no formal analysis of whether that's the case or not, and I think we'd find if we were looking at carefully at the stats, we'd find that T levels are not serving this group well. It closes down routes to university, to higher education. There's a massive overrepresentation in BTECs of learners with SEND compared to A-levels, for example, in terms of those who progress on to university. So we will be taking that away without a proven alternative. I think there are real risks.
I was going to just reference a report, if I may, that we published last year as a campaign called Desperate Measures. And what we attempted to do there was answer the question that the government wasn't able to answer, which is, what are these students going to do when presented with a choice of an A-level or a T-level? And we found there was 155,000 young people that would fall through the qualifications gap that would be created if we moved to a model of A-levels and T-levels. Many of those students, they would be disproportionately, they would have SEN, they would be disadvantaged, they would have lower levels of prior attainment. And the previous government had their answer to that was they could do another level 2 qualification, or they could do the T-level transition programme, which, as we know, we discussed earlier, 92% of students don't progress as well. So I think what's kind of astonishing about this whole debate is even that we're even having this debate, because the case for retaining the 3 routes is so strong. As Ruth was saying, the government's own impact assessment was really, really clear that these young people would be the most sort of disadvantaged. You'd be disadvantaging the already disadvantaged. And the point about higher education is really important. We have the National Education Opportunities Network, which is a campaign partner. They work with universities that specialise in widening access as well. And they found that the most disadvantaged quarter of young people would not progress to university if the BTEC route was taken away. They said that it would set back widening participation by years, if not decades. So I think what you've heard today, I mean, even from this answer, but more broadly, there is a consensus that we need to keep these 3 routes. So it is kind of extraordinary that, last week the government was saying, they published a white paper aimed at how to reduce the number of young people not in education, employment or training, and yet next week the same government could scrap qualifications that do more than anything else to prevent people from becoming not in education, employment or training. Again, disproportionately disadvantaged, SEN, low prior attainment. So there is a very, very small constituency that's pushing this, that's saying we have to have T levels, we need to get rid of BTECs. But actually, when you talk to the majority of people, there is no support in the kind of majority for moving to that 2-route model.
Just very quickly on the stats.
Can I bring Caroline in with your question, which is related? I'm really, really mindful of time, if that's okay, but that should enable you to make any additional points that you want to in relation to Manuela's question as well.
Thank you, Chair. So we know that students with SEND are more likely to pursue applied general and tech level qualifications than their peers. So what do you think the government should do to mitigate the impact on students with SEND if funding is withdrawn from these qualifications?
I don't like that conditional bit at the end. The strongest thing I would say was do not withdraw that funding. Absolutely. I think you're on a hiding to nothing taking that away. I think one we could look at the accessibility route by route. There's a route by route review of the T levels going on to try and improve accessibility. There are changes that would enable more learners to access them. I would really strongly recommend that in any future research done by government that they talk to providers who are not offering T levels and ask why not, and they talk to providers who are and ask them which learners are they steering away from T levels and why, because that's a bit of untapped information that I think would give a lot of clarity and a case for retaining the third route.
And just quickly, in your written submission to the review, you suggested that some BTECs and other AGQs would benefit from updated content rather than defunding. So what sort of changes do you think would benefit students with SEND in the content of those qualifications?
I think we have a sort of a Save the BTEC campaign. It isn't save them and never reform them, never revise them, never make them better than they are at the moment. It's about saving the model, the approach, and so on. But updating, there's room, I think, for more use of technology. There's a sort of a modernisation that could be taking place. More flexible ways of working. I think there are more flexibilities that could be brought into the structure themselves. But I think that's more fine-tuning particular BTEC content. I don't think there's anything that's screaming out for change. It was really a recognition that we're not saying we've got something perfect as it is, but we've got a model that works, and let's make sure the content's as up to date as possible.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, look, very, very quickly, and I'm really grateful that you've mentioned young people with SEND, and I think they are the perfect example through which we can look at the lens of the binary nature of this particular reform. Particularly those of us that work with young people and adults with SEND, you know for sure one size doesn't fit all, and having a much broad, individualised approach is what you need to empower those young people and adults to be able to move on in life, to acquire qualification and achieve as well as anybody else. So if we just singularly looked at it through the lens of SEND, I think it would be pretty obvious that one size doesn't fit all. But we must also remember that the number of young people, particularly with SEND, isn't going to decrease, it's going to increase. And so therefore that places greater urgency for me in providing a broader church that allows us to be able to individualise to individual needs in a way that helps particularly those young people with SEND to succeed. Achievement by examination and an assessment only by examination is a huge impact for young people with SEND. It's a huge impact for us as providers. I have to shut my college down for one day when we do GCSEs alone in order to be able to accommodate concessions and extra support for young people with SEND. So there is a much wider infrastructure implication to that as well. So I think it's worth considering through the lens. So thank you for asking.
No, just to reiterate the point, coursework can be successful, and actually in life we're not asked to do exams. We're asked to work together collaboratively, do projects, do presentations, and college staff are well versed in doing internal assessment and then being able to sample. So I just think having greater flexibility, and I totally agree with the point about looking at how we can use digital solutions as well.
Caroline, briefly.
It's a very short question. Catherine, you talked about assessment. Most students do A-levels as a majority. How reliable is the grading and assessment for those?
So in terms of grading assessment, and that, going back to what Simon's already said, I think that could also be another whole hour of conversation. So obviously assessment through an examination which is then externally assessed is one method of assessment. But I think there are other options for assessment which can be carried out, and it's very much a cliff edge, and particularly for young people who have learning difficulties and disabilities, to go into a room, whether that's a room on your own because you need that, and then you've got extra time, you're put into a pressurised situation. The opportunity to actually show your creativity, to be able to do design, to work on a project, I think means that we're not just working towards students who achieve well at exams. Some people do, some people don't, and I think we need to be mindful that we have different skill sets and we need to recognise those.
Thank you. I'm going to go to our last question, if that's okay, Manuela.
I'm going to kind of combine this. So obviously, what are some of the wider pressures facing the further education sector, and also if the Education Committee were to conduct an inquiry into further education, including looking at funding, skills, curriculum, what issues should we explore and why?
Just wanted to give you that opportunity. We're
chomping at the bit on that one.
Where do we start?
What a wonderful question, Manuel. Thank you.
Simon, do you want to kick off on that one?
I think without question, primarily the biggest thing that affects most further education providers would be the English and Maths reset policy, without question. And let me make sure I quantify something so that you don't go away with a poor apprehension. This isn't about saying young people don't need further development on literacy and numeracy, but we've had a reset policy in place now since 2014 that's been forced and mandated, and whilst more young people might be sitting the same subjects over and over and over again, we're still not doing enough to change that dial to allow more young people to achieve literacy and numeracy. We're forcing a square peg through a round hole, and that needs looking at with the utmost of urgency, without denigrating the fact that actually young people do want to study English and Maths in some way, shape or form. That's my number one. Sorry.
Work along.
My number one, you won't be surprised, I would really like the committee to look at the role of further education providers, specialist and mainstream, in working with young people with SEND. It's a huge part of what the FE sector does, but it's often overlooked in terms of FE and skills policy. And it's often sort of shunted towards SEND policy, but that's mainly focused on schools. So it falls into some sort of gap in the middle. I think we could be looking at how LSIPs could better embrace students with SEND. We could be looking at how they could be used to leverage disability youth employment. We could be looking at how the youth guarantee recently announced could serve young disabled people. There's loads we could be exploring. We know government has said FE is a priority. We know they've said SEND is a priority. But I fear unless we've got a real sort of ministerial commitment to bringing those two things together, then opportunities will be lost.
First of all, you should definitely do a review on this, and I think actually the review that you've done today, in case we don't get an opportunity, is really valuable, because the decision next week is so important. It's flown under the radar, so this short piece of work you've done today is really valuable. We have a manifesto pre-election about what we wanted to see, and I could sum that up in 9 words, which is raise the rate, don't scrap BTECs, and leave us alone. And the raise the rate part is important. Core funding is really key. It's much lower than it should be. In sixth form colleges, it's 22% lower than it is in secondary schools. That can't be right. Don't scrap BTECs, we may have covered already today. And leave us alone is really important. The amount of interference from government, the amount of bureaucracy, the amount of audit, the amount of people looking over our collective shoulder is absolutely extraordinary, and it grows every year. So I suppose our message would be, give the experts the tools to do the job and let them get on with it. And I think that's a really important point. And if I could make two final points. One is equality. We're currently engaged in a kind of legal case with the department over teacher pay. They've made the inexplicable decision to give that to teachers in schools, but not teachers in colleges, which we think is something that can't really be defended. And a more technical thing, but actually it sounds boring, but it's really important. The way the Department for Education works, there's 2 silos, the skills in colleges and the schools. So actually, rather than talking about FE, let's talk about sixth form, let's talk about 16 to 19, let's talk about post-16, but let's not have solutions for colleges and solutions for schools and academies. Let's have solutions for the age group.
Lots of things already covered. So English and Maths, definitely, because it has such an impact on young people and providers. Funding, already described. Funding impacts on staffing. So I was speaking to a principal last week who is going to have to make really difficult decisions, again, about electrical, because it's so difficult to find staff. And the reason it's so difficult to find staff is being able to pay the rate that people need to be able to say they're going to commit to work in further education. And for most people working in industry, that means a pay cut. So I think it would be good to look at that, how we can focus and encourage more people into the sector so that we can deliver on those skills. Triangulation and how we all work together in social partnership. And also to look at the system as a whole. So CAR looks at Key Stage 1 to post-16, but colleges also deliver apprenticeships, they deliver to adults. And it's really important that we have an adult strategy. We also deliver HE. So it's looking at it in the whole, looking at the whole ecosystem within any given area, really important. And can we have more of that joined up thinking, I think, is so important. Speaking to James's point about schools and skills, it would be really great if we could have more joint working.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming to give your evidence today. It's been really interesting and helpful to us.
Thank you.
And that concludes our first panel. If we could change over, thank you.
Right.
Order. If I can resume our session this morning on Level 3 qualifications. Thank you very much to you, all of the witnesses, for our second panel, and apologies that we are slightly overrunning from the first panel. Thank you for your patience. Can I invite all three of you, first of all, to introduce yourselves to the committee, starting with Alice Gardner.
Hello, very nice to be here today. My name is Alice Gardner. I'm the Chief Executive of the Edge Foundation. We're an independent foundation. We're interested in young people acquiring the skills, knowledge and behaviours they need to succeed in work and life. We're lucky to have an incredibly dynamic team made up of researchers, policy individuals and the practice team to help us to find ways in which we can help and support on good policy making and make sure that we're able to put forward the student voice. And on that note, today we launched our latest T-level report, which is the student voice. So 200 young people talking about their experience on T-levels, which I'm sure we'll in some way get onto today.
Thank you very much. David Robinson.
Good morning all. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Vulnerable Learners and Post-16 at the Education Policy Institute.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Burden. I'm a Director of Programmes at the Gatsby Foundation.
Thank you very much. We have heard that there are concerns about the scope and timing of the government's review into Level 3 qualification reforms and the impact that it's had on students, on schools, on colleges and on teachers. What is your assessment of the government's review and the previous government's reform in recent years? Perhaps we go the other way this time, start with Jennifer.
Thank you. So if we're thinking about the purpose of the review, which I think is a good place to start, the purpose of the first review, the reform of qualifications, we really have had with that an opportunity to think about making sure that all qualifications, because it isn't just about Level 3, but from entry level up to Level 3, had a clear purpose and also clear oversight, which we'd obviously want for every qualification for every young person. And so we really think that's a positive step. It's both an economic imperative, because if we think about the case for change and reform, skills needs were not being met, but it's also a really important opportunity for us to make sure that every young person has access to a high quality study programme. There are several, if we think about the several elements that have been put in place by that first review, there are sort of three that are very important. The first one being a recognition that academic and technical education are distinct, they're not the same. The second, taking that distinction of purpose through to the design of qualifications so that they either have that line of sight through to academic university education, or they're looking at the line of sight through to skilled work, which might be direct or it might be after further study. And then the third thing is that all of those qualifications, and this is built into the reforms, need to be based on national standards. So that's not the case for qualifications as it is currently. So that is the case for A-levels, it is the case for GCSEs, it is the case for T-levels. Just as taking T-levels as an example, they're based on occupational standards, which are set through the work of currently the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. That will move to Skills England. But those are occupational standards that are set by employers to say these are the skills, this is the knowledge, this is the skills that you need to be successful in an occupation. Employers then scope the outline content for T levels, there was a process for consultation on that, and then awarding organisations set the specification. But you will not have that, so you don't have that same process. So it's really important for other qualifications that we have that strong oversight. I think it's often quite a surprise to people that we don't have that oversight. So I'll stop there because I hope that sets a useful background.
Thank you. David?
Okay, so I think the government is right to pause defunding of overlapping qualifications. Our research has suggested that T levels are challenging qualifications. They do lead to good outcomes for those students who complete them, but they are more challenging than existing overlapping qualifications. Our research showed that around 5% of T level, only 5% of T level students haven't previously achieved a level 2 English and Maths or a grade 4 or above in those subjects, whereas it's 25% haven't achieved that threshold for those taking defunded qualifications due to be defunded. So I think the serious questions around where that extra 20% of students are going to go. Don't think the transition programme is the solution for those students for reasons might come on to later. So I think it is right that the government's pausing on this review. I do, however, think there is room in the medium term to continue to rationalise qualifications, particularly smaller level 3 qualifications, because T levels, of course, are large and challenging T level qualifications.
Thank you. Alice?
I think I'd echo quite a lot of what David said then. I mean, T levels certainly aren't for all, and I think the piece of work that we're publishing today from a student's perspective shows that they are challenging, which is a good thing, but it means it's possibly not the route for every young person, and the statistics suggest that a third in wave 3 dropped out versus 90% retention on A levels and BTECs. So I think we just need to be careful how we approach this. So a pause and review is probably timely and a good thing. However, we need to look at it in the context of what else is happening. So the curriculum review, the launch of Skills England. Let's not do this too quickly in advance of those two things coming down the line. Let's think about whether or not there is room to rationalise in a steady way initially until we know what's going to happen with the curriculum review and indeed Skills England. I think what we've got to be careful of, and it was a nod there from David, is that there are overlap, but there are a number of students who will need that overlap and the option to do BTECs or other qualifications in this area, and we want to make sure that we don't take away that choice. Quality is incredibly important, so I don't think we should try and set this up as a dichotomy between quality and T levels, but let's think about this carefully and not act rashly.
Thank you very much. So we might have the outcome of the government's review as soon as next week. What would good look like from the perspective of your various organisations? David, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think I covered some of this in my previous answer, but I think continue with the rollout of T levels. I think there perhaps is some room for rationalisation or removal of some qualifications that overlap with T levels that are a similar size to T levels, because one of the key things from our research is that they are challenging, but that is partly because of the size of those qualifications. I think for the moment, maintain a range of other options at smaller sizes, but then in the medium term, rationalise those qualifications as well, possibly in a similar model to the one that's been introduced for T levels, where we have a franchise model with one awarding body per qualification.
Thank you. Jennifer?
So I think you won't be surprised that we'd like to see the phased removal of funding to continue. We think that gives the most opportunity for more students to access high quality programmes. There'd be that A-levels combined with alternative academic qualifications, or T-levels, or for some students, and we mustn't forget other levels. I know we're talking a lot about level 3 here, but for example, those strong level 2 pathways that give them really good opportunities to enter work or into apprenticeships.
Thank you. Alice?
I think it's really important that we acknowledge the challenges across all the qualifications, because I think if we don't acknowledge what the issues are, then we can't possibly fix them. So there are clearly some issues in terms of uptake of some qualifications, so low numbers, and possibly we should be challenging the quality within that. But at the same time, and again echoing what David said, T levels are a very chunky qualification, the equivalent in effect of 3 A levels, which doesn't allow that mix and match which a lot of students thrive on. We did some polling earlier this year of the general public, and 74% of those felt that having a broad range of choice at that age was really important. So thinking about some sort of baccalaureate style, so that kind of mix and match of majors and minors, giving young people the opportunity to be able to be stretched but also not narrowing their choices. So I think for us, we would like to see a very persuasive case for cutting funding for qualifications at this stage, while we wait to see what happens with the curriculum review and Skills England.
Thank you. Serena.
Thank you. The government has described T levels as the core of post-16 technical education. However, our predecessor committee found very little evidence, inadequate evidence, that T levels more effectively prepare students for progression, meet industry needs, or promote social mobility. So I'd like to hear your views on T levels. And I'll start with Alice, please, and then move down.
I think those are all very valid questions. I think the concept of T levels is a good one, but I think there are lots of challenges. So one of the things that's come out in our report today, listening to the young person's voice, is the fact that they absolutely loved the work placements, and that's a really positive and good thing. However, there was a lot of variation about the quality of that, whether the placement was really connected properly with their course, so whether they felt that the work they were doing in the workplace was reflected back into their academic work. A lot of the young people felt that they had been guided into T levels without really understanding what it was, what they were going to be doing, and whether that was actually going to help them in their progression routes. We know that a lot of young people at the moment going through T levels see university as their destination, and that's absolutely fine. However, surely if you're going to have a gold standard technical route, you should be looking at all the pathways to success. So that's apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships, higher level apprenticeships, as well as going straight into the workplace. And I'm not sure that we've got that quite right yet, because a lot of people finishing level 3 T level would probably their employer would probably be quite keen to put them on a level 3 apprenticeship, but then you're doubling up on the qualification. They might not be ready to do a level 4 or a level 5. So we just need to think about how that works. And certainly when we've been talking to students and employers in the healthcare tracks, they've said that sometimes students who finish their T level on that track are not ready to go into the workplace at the level they need, having finished that T level. So there seems to be some gap between the kind of honest intention and the actual delivery on that. So I think there is quite a lot to think about. I think that mix and match concept is really important. So you can at the moment do an A level and a BTEC, and you can combine those two routes together. Whereas with T levels, because it's so chunky, you've got to pick your T level, and that's your route. It's very difficult then to migrate between the pathways. And I think we've learned over the last 10 years or so that actually choice is really important. A broad and balanced curriculum that allows young people to thrive is what allows them to be good in the workplace, but also achieve in life. And I think ultimately, isn't that what we want for young people?
David?
So our research suggests that actually T levels are quite successful for those students who succeed in completing the T level. Those students are more likely to progress to an apprenticeship or a higher technical qualification. But as I've said previously, they are challenging, so they are not for all students. Students who take T levels are 20% less likely to achieve their qualifications, similar students taking alternative level 3 qualifications. We also know that disadvantaged students are more likely to drop out of their T level, and a third of those who do drop out then don't continue on to other education and training. So they are good for those who succeed, but I don't think they can be the only level 3 option without pushing other students, pushing more students down to take level 2 qualifications instead, at a time when actually we know that the returns to existing level 3 qualifications, the employment outcomes are good for those students who take those qualifications.
Thank you. I'd pick up on size first. I think that's a valid point. So T levels are large, and they need to be. Historically, we have had much smaller programs than you would see in strong technical education systems. So it's very important to increase the amount of time our young people have to develop their technical knowledge and skills. So that was a very positive step. We also need to recognise that the reforms do not remove the possibility of combining A-levels and small AAQs, so those mixed programmes are still available within the reforms. But that doesn't mean that there's a third way. If you look at the international evidence, and it's useful to look at international evidence, not to pick it up and drop it in ours, but to see what the practice is. When you look at the international evidence, there are clear academic and technical pathways across majority of OECD countries and the countries where you would see strong technical education. What you do see in the academic track, though, is some flavour of academic pathways. So you'll have academic pathway that is very much that core, I'm heading to a research-focused university, really fast-tracking. And then you will also see academic pathways internationally where they have that very strong core of robust academic learning, like A-levels in our case, and alongside that opportunities to take some options for more applied learning, like the small AAQs. So those are still very much academic paths because they're designed to progress students on for academic study. Just picking up on destinations, because I think that was mentioned. We've been looking at students' destinations for T-levels. I'd like to thank actually the providers, T-level providers who are working with us to provide that information. And we've produced a report for the first cohort, and we're shortly going to produce the report for the second cohort. I'm going to give you an example from that data. So we've had, looking at a sample of over 300 health T-level students with a known destination, 92% of that sample were in apprenticeship, employment or further study. So those destinations might be directly into employment, so that could be healthcare support workers or healthcare assistants. Forgive me if I'm reading this because I want to get the numbers right. They may move into apprenticeship pathways, so that covers nursing, dental nursing, pharmacy technician, or students who need to take some further study because they need to undertake an undergraduate degree in order to move into those areas. Will be moving into nursing, midwifery, and across allied health professions. And there, over 85% of the students moving on to higher education did so into health-related roles. So this is really important that moving into the destination, that it's really heartening to see, because we know the dedicated work that providers and employers are putting into setting up industry placements. That's a very strong part of the T-level. It's not the only part, but it is a very strong part. And we actually see from the learner survey, DFE's funded learner survey, pretty high satisfaction across the industry placement. I mean, I take your point, Alice, that we would want that to be 100%.
Can I just push you, and then I'm going to bring Patrick in on this question as well. So that is an analysis of the feedback from students who do T-levels, who are currently about a tenth of all post-16 students. In your previous answer, you indicated that for students who really couldn't access either T-levels or A-levels, one option for them is to just take another level 2 qualification. So I just want to push you on the question of progression for students. So you are acknowledging that there are some students who, as things currently stand, cannot access either A-levels or T-levels. Is it really acceptable that we say to those students, just go and do another qualification at the same level? There is no progression route for you. You just stick at level 2.
I think that is quite interesting. I think we have a way of thinking about levels in this country that suggests that if you move into a different area and that and you are moving into, say, you move from school where you've been attempting level 2 qualifications, and you move into college and you might start at level 1 or level 2. I think Kath mentioned that earlier, that is somehow a step back. Actually, what we're saying to students is we want to be really aspirational for you, and the way to do that is to extend your programme. So we're aspirational for you to reach level 3, but we think you need more time. We want to give you more time to do that. So if
level 3 is defunded, there isn't a level 3. And I mean, that's the implication of narrowing down the courses, is that course that allows that progression might not be available anymore.
For those students who would have taken those courses previously, then there are other options. So they may move into a mixed programme, they might take a T-level, it may take longer to get to their T-level, so they may need to take the foundation year to be ready to prepare for that, or they may take a strong level 2 programme that gives them access into the workplace.
I suppose along the same vein, we touched on this with the previous panel, but how do you square T-levels as a true equal to A-levels while also ensuring they're accessible to all learners with all learning styles?
So I think we heard earlier from the panel that the department is undertaking a route-by-route review of T-levels, and we'd really welcome that. I think that's it's valid. We've been collecting feedback from providers on T-levels in terms of how they're working, mainly in our case to inform the work that we do to develop teaching resources to support T-levels, which I know are important. But I think it's worth taking the time to champion the providers that have quietly embraced T-levels and are doing a fantastic job to deliver them. On T-levels results day, for example, it was my privilege to go to Blackpool and the Fylde College, one of the most deprived areas of our country, where they have really embraced T-levels, and over the last 3 years have seen strong outcomes for their students across their intake. So this is something that does need work. Providers are working hard to make sure that T-levels are accessible, and we do need that very important stepping stone for students to go through into progression. So, okay. It's not
We don't need to do anything in relation to that one.
I mean, sorry, I should let the rest of the panel answer.
So I don't think, as they are currently structured, that a model of just A-levels and T-levels can provide access for all students for some of the reasons I've sort of mentioned previously around the level of challenge. I think the idea... As they're currently structured,
yeah. Getting at, do we change the shape of T-levels and make them a wider number with varying levels of complexity, assessment styles? This is what I'm getting at.
So I mean, yes, of course you can reform the qualification and make it smaller, perhaps less challenging in some respects, or more accessible to a wider variety of students. But I actually think some of the benefits of T-levels are around parity of esteem, the level of challenge, the success of students coming off those programmes. I think what I would rather do is take the model of T-levels where they have simplified the market of qualifications, or they were aiming to simplify the market, but apply that to smaller level 3 qualifications as well. And I think that's where you could provide a range of options. Student profiles are often quite, they're not homogenous. Students may want to take a variety of either level 2, level 3 qualifications, academic, technical qualifications, and actually research suggests that employment outcomes for students who do take a variety are often very good. So I think for me, perhaps extending the model of T-levels to make them accessible to make progression options accessible to a wide range of students is the way to go. But T-levels on their own as currently structured, I don't think work. And just briefly coming back on the previous sort of points around the transition program being a stepping stone for those students who aren't quite ready for a T-level. I mean, our research suggested that is not working as it's currently structured. Only a very, very small percentage of students actually progress from the transition programme, less than 10% progress from the transition programme onto a T level. And of those who do, around a third drop out in the first year. So that programme, as it's currently structured, is not working against its stated aims of transitioning students onto T levels.
Yeah. Alice? I think that we are maybe getting, we as a country get very hung up on technical versus academic, when actually what most young people and indeed adults like is variety, and that's how they thrive and that's how they learn. So actually maybe the question could be more about whether or not it's time to think about a baccalaureate style qualification which allows you to have a twin track of major and minor subjects so that you can do academic alongside technical and vocational, and you're not narrowing your choices. So take some of the great bits that are working with T levels and the good bits that are working in academic qualifications, and look at whether or not actually we could have a much more radical look at what the 16 to 19 year curriculum really looks like. And actually that way you could spend much more time thinking about how all young people could access that, and they would be given more time to get to the end of the programme if they needed it, but also much more choice and without too much speciality too early on. It's never good to say that you must take this, as a young person, you must take this route, this is the route you've chosen, there is no migration, there is no room to change your mind. Because we're asking these young people to make some fairly significant choices pretty early. We know that careers, information, advice and guidance, well, there's never been a golden age, and certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, I think with various cuts to careers, advice and guidance, you know, the PE teacher on Friday afternoon doing their bit, we really need to think about what's happening also pre-16 to allow young people to really understand what their choices are going to look like later on. So I would be nervous of cutting back too much on overlap at the moment, because I think there's some much bigger decisions to be made which would really allow the government to think about what is next. So I think keeping options open for young people is really important. And we haven't mentioned SEND pupils either, and I want to make clear that SEND doesn't mean that they have a lack of academic ability, it just means they have various challenges they need to meet. And I'm not sure that T levels, from the information that we have at the moment, is allowing them to thrive as much as they might or could or should.
Thank you. We're going to go to Caroline. That's good.
Thank you. We have sort of briefly touched on this, but if we just look at the number of students finishing their course, only 21% of students who started T levels in 2022 finished their course. So could you give us an indication of why you think T levels have a much lower retention rate compared to other level 3 qualifications?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I think, interestingly, listening directly to the students, there seem to be several things going on here. One, I think, goes back to that point about careers, information, advice and guidance. I'm not 100% sure they know what they're getting themselves into. Yeah. A lot of them have ended up, from the work that we've done, and this is on 200 students talking about their experiences on T levels. It wasn't necessarily a proactive choice, it was a sort of guided choice. You know, we're doing T levels now, you know, you might be suited to it. So I think the expectation versus the reality, there was a gap there. I think the challenge that we've talked about, chunky, 3 A levels, it's provided more challenge, I think, than some young people expected, and they found that very classroom orientated teaching quite heavy, while they have really enjoyed the 45-day or equivalent in hours of the work placement, although some have found that it hasn't connected directly to their learning, which is so important if that's going to add real value. So I think there's a gap between expectation and reality, and I think that's tricky. I think that mentoring is really important, and I think we've seen that on apprenticeships, and where students are kind of slightly left to flounder, then their reaction is to drop out where they don't have the support, particularly collectively, around them. And some of the students that are going to be coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds may find that they haven't got that wraparound support they need that helps to guide them through the qualification. And it's about social capital, and sometimes they don't have that either. So I think there's there's quite a lot going on there. I think teacher retention was also mentioned among young people as being an issue. So they were just finding they were getting into the swing of whoever was leading their course and then they leave. We know that's an issue in FE and in secondary teaching at the moment, but it seemed to be a particular issue on for these young students on T levels, and I think that leads to inconsistency of delivery. We also know that there wasn't a lot of guidance early on, so the first cohorts felt that the teaching might have been inconsistent as well, and we had some comments from the tutors themselves saying that they didn't have an awful lot of backup, so they weren't 100% sure if they were delivering the T levels in their most effective way to get the best outcome. So of course that has an impact on the learner as well. So I think there's a lot going on there, and this is a fledgling qualification. I'm not saying it couldn't work. It's just without acknowledging the challenges, it won't work. And by in effect binning the competitive qualifications to force uptake, I mean to me that just seems the most unholy, ridiculous course of action.
So our research, of course, covered the fact that more students were more likely to drop out, but unfortunately we didn't cover the why. I think actually the Edge Foundation's work nicely fills the gap that we created there. So I don't really have much to add beyond what Alice has covered there.
Thank you. So we know that students often do change their mind about a programme of study after they start. So about 1 in 5 students withdraw from large vocational qualifications. We're not talking about T levels. I think it's really interesting that when we were talking about it earlier, it's important to understand that across the piece. So not solely focus on T levels, but that's, I think, an area that we ought to know more about. Retention for T levels has been slightly lower than in comparable large qualifications. It is a new qualification, and some of the things that Alice was talking about there are valid. As a teacher, when you start a new qualification, you do tend to teach to the specification. You're getting used to the sense of the breadth and the depth that you need to go into. We would want teachers to have more resources in that case, and that's some of the work that we're doing helps to shape that. But then what happens is, as you get used to the qualification, you see the connections between the various areas, and you start to shape it and sequence it in a way that suits you, your students. And one of the things that we've heard from teachers that we're working on the resources is that the T-level structure gives them more freedom to do that, because they can link topics together that are they're not in separate units, so they can do that. So there's a lot of, it's really interesting to see teachers starting to grasp the T levels and make them their own. So I think there are elements there that will see that figure rising over time. It might, if you don't mind, I would like to pick up the point on the transition year as well. I take the point, David, that we're not seeing significant numbers moving into T levels, but it's really important to note that the transition year overall showed higher progression to level 3 than other level 2 programmes. It's a programme that's been developed with teachers, working with the Association of Colleges, working with the Department for Education to shape that foundation year. We think that foundation year should be available to all students who need extra time before moving on to level 3, whether they're going to move on to an academic path, whether they're going to move on to a technical path. If they choose to move into an apprenticeship, that is not a poor outcome. We should simply be helping students who need more time to get ready for level 3 to have it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask you briefly what can be done to support students who choose to withdraw from T levels, especially those who are most susceptible to leaving education and training altogether? And obviously if we defund the other qualifications, then we are narrowing their options if they drop out of T levels. So what can we do to support them? Start with Jennifer. We'll go the other way.
So I mean, I think as we were talking earlier about what happens to students when they withdraw from any course. The majority of them do withdraw early on and move on to another course. But we do need actually more research across the piece at what happens to young people who leave their courses and what interventions will be best approach for them in that case.
You're advocating the defunding of AGQs. If they've struggled with T levels, if they're too academic, 3 A levels is the equivalent of 3 A levels. That's quite a lot for somebody who is choosing not to go down an A level pathway. So if we defund technical qualifications, where do those people go? What do they do?
I think it's more about their starting point. So if we know that they're going to need more time to be ready to take a T level or to move into an academic
ready to take
pathway,
a T level.
That's true, and that's true for students now who don't all progress on to level 3. But what we need to have is stronger level 2 pathways for those students with oversight. I mentioned it at the start of the discussion. Those qualifications have no national oversight of content now, either for technical or on the academic space. Outside of A-levels, GCSEs, T-levels and some other specialist qualifications, government has no national oversight, very little national oversight of the content of those qualifications. And that's a fundamentally important part of the qualifications reform, that we can make sure that those level 2 qualifications have strong stepping points into employment. Because at the time, I'll just finish, at the time that a student takes that qualification and perhaps moves into the workplace or takes an apprenticeship, that level 3 may be right for them later in their career journey. So what we need to make sure is that we've got good options that are well funded for them as an adult learner, as an older learner, rather than expecting all young people to follow that single path to level 3 at an age when they may simply need more time.
So I would echo some of Jennifer's points around I don't think there's enough research of what works well in this area, and I don't know whether there's space for the Education Endowment Fund maybe to think about what works for students, the kind of interventions that successfully move students onto good outcomes. Though I do think having a range of level 3 qualifications, smaller qualifications, would allow students to still get those level 3 qualifications, which, as I've said, existing qualifications do lead to good employment outcomes for young people. I think another important point here, though, is for those students who take 3 years of 16 to 19 study, the funding falls off quite significantly for students in the 3rd year of study. So those students who may need most support actually will struggle to get the same amount of support because of that extra year of study. So I think that's one thing that the government could be looking at, which is matching the rate for the 1st and 2nd year for the 3rd year of 16 to 19 study.
I think it's worth thinking about why originally the funding was being looked at for AGQs, and it was probably motivated by the lack of take-up for T-levels. So the last government was thinking, well, how do we increase take-up? One of the ways we can do that is to remove some of the competition for students. That isn't a good starting point, because you're not, in policy you should be looking for what you're trying to achieve. What is the outcome? What are we trying to achieve here? And that doesn't feel like a good starting point. So here we are, we've inherited this kind of point where we're having a pause and review. A pause and review shouldn't be about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm sure there are plenty of level 3 qualifications that need reviewing and probably need defunding, either because they have low uptake or perhaps they don't provide the quality or the stretch that students need. But to then think that we should defund all level 3 qualifications that overlap with T levels, when your question goes to the heart of the point, where there's so high dropout rate already with students who've been earmarked as those who will potentially thrive on a T level, we're undermining the students' opportunities to succeed. And I don't think anyone from any political persuasion wants that. We want the very best outcomes for young people. We want that to match the skills and needs of employers, because this is a social and economic imperative. Social because it's right that young people have the ability to be able to thrive in their life and be a really good source to their community and be part of that economic community. But on the other hand, for the economy, employers are saying to us all the time that young people aren't meeting their needs. So we have an economic and social imperative to get this right. So how do we stop young people dropping out? Well, part of it is by them having a choice and choosing the best route. And I think if you have a dichotomy, where it's A levels or T levels, then you're removing that option for choice and permeation between the tracks. The other way that you could prevent dropout on level 3 qualifications full stop is to have a review of what happens pre-16 and have a much broader and balanced curriculum in advance of 16 and look at the way that qualifications are assessed, look at the curriculum in its entirety, think about whether Progress 8 still is fit for purpose, whether the EBAC is the right move. And if we get it right pre-16, then those students getting to that point at 16 and making big decisions about what's next will be able to make much better choices about what's right for them, which will help to prevent dropout. But you can't force young people on a pathway that they are not suited to and then expect them to see it out and then pass at the end. And T levels are quite complex. They've got their year-end exams, they've got the employer elements, they have to pass all of that to get their certificate at the end of it. It seems to me there's an opportunity for T levels to be good for some students, but then plenty of other AGQs that are very suitable for lots of other students that will help them progress either to university or onto an apprenticeship or straight into work. So I just think it's about keeping the student in mind. You know, this shouldn't be about dogma or political posturing. This should be about how do we best get young people into a position where they can get a good job and contribute to society both economically and socially.
Thank you. And I've just got a question for David here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So the Education Policy Institute has recently recommended the introduction of smaller alternatives to T levels to enable access for a wider range of students. Could you just very quickly say what you think the advantages and challenges are with this change?
Yeah, so just to flesh that out, I don't think what we were proposing was that we introduce yet another qualification into an already complex market. I think what we were getting at was that it is a complex market, and one of the advantages of T levels, or the intent of T levels, was the rationalisation of that market. It is the case that there are many, many more choices, qualifications available to young people going down the technical or applied route than there are for the academic route. And extending the model of T levels to smaller level 3 qualifications in a way that either you have one awarding body per qualification, or indeed you have more of an A-level style model where you've got more of the standardisation that you have for A-levels, but multiple awarding bodies operating within that standardised approach would, I think, help student choice and provide a choice in a market that is quite complex at the moment.
Thank you.
Manuela, but I need to ask you to be really, really brief.
Yeah, so it's actually a question for Jennifer and about the SEND cohort of students. So we know that SEND students are much less likely to take up level 3 qualifications. What kind of support would you want to see for this cohort of students to take up the T levels and T levels with widened participation?
The last T-level action plan, I was just checking the data on that. The students taking T-levels with SEND support, EHC plans, was 10.5% of the cohort. So that's good to see. They are accessing T-levels. That figure was 15% for students with any level 3 course aim. So it's smaller, but I'm not surprised by that at this stage of the rollout of T-levels. And you can see that increasing. It's very important on the industry placement that there are flexibilities for students with SEND needs, and those are in place so that they can make sure that they can benefit from that experience. And we also need to look hard at the resources that we're providing to support teachers in delivering T levels. The DFE's route by route review, Kath mentioned it earlier, where colleges have been feeding in on information about each T level pathway. We haven't seen the outcomes from that, but would imagine there has been a strong conversation about SEND learners and how flexibilities that are within, say, the industry placement and so on can support them.
Yes.
There is evidence that disadvantaged students, as well as those from working class and minority ethnic backgrounds who enter higher education, are more likely to hold applied qualifications such as BTECs than their peers. What specific action should the government take to ensure these students are not deterred from going to university or pursuing other higher education options if BTECs are defunded?
This isn't supposed to be facetious, but I kind of think that you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I mean, we don't want to narrow their opportunities, so let's not defund their route to university. And BTECs, as you quite rightly say, for those young people that you mentioned, are one of their best and most effective routes in, recognised by universities and by employers. So why would we want to stem their opportunity to access higher education?
So I think the challenge for disadvantaged students is partly in accessing qualifications. Alice has mentioned the need to keep a range of qualifications as alternatives to T levels. But actually the challenges that we see for disadvantaged students, I think, are much wider than the particular qualification choices. We know that from our research that disadvantaged students fall further behind in the 16 to 19 phase. It may be no coincidence that actually disadvantaged funding as a whole falls by about a third between the secondary phase and the 16 to 19 phase. And I don't think there is any underlying rationale for why there is that funding fall. We in other organisations have previously called for a student premium to mirror the pupil premium that exists in primary and secondary school to support students and support institutions with a large proportion of disadvantaged students to support greater outcomes for those students.
So I think it's fair that one of the concerns around offering AGQs for students rather than perhaps mixed programmes with A-levels and AAQs are the outcomes of grades. So student providers seeking to ensure that students get the highest grades, that's completely understandable. Students who don't get the highest grades in their A-levels or mixed programmes aren't stopped then from accessing university, and evidence shows that students who take A-levels are less likely to drop out and they're more likely to graduate with a 2-1 or a first than those with BTECs. So recent data from the Office for Students in particular shows that students who entered with 3 distinctions in their BTEC were less likely to get a first or a second than those with 3 Ds at A-level. Now, this is data that we can go back and forth on. It's complicated by the fact that those students are more likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds or be a non-traditional entrant to university. And they're often not gaining equality actually with their peers from their time at university. And Director of Fair Access at OFS has been really clear that the job of widening participation isn't just about getting people into university. And we absolutely agree that it's really important that university degrees are open to all those who want to take them, but we would really encourage policymakers to take a system-wide view and to think about the quality of outcome for those entering university rather than simply the numbers enrolling, and consider whether greater benefits there are from extending the duration of the 16 to 19 programme in the way that we've talked about, and absolutely agree with David on full funding, so that those students can access the qualifications that are getting the best outcomes when they do move on to university.
Thank you. And we're going to go to Amanda.
Thank you. So the IFS have estimated that it will cost government around $400 million to sustain 16 to 19 education funding in its current level per student. But in the recent budget for further education, $300 million was allocated. What are the likely consequences of this shortfall for the sector?
Shall I start? I think further education is always sort of overlooked. We have quite a disjointed system between primary, secondary, further education, sixth form colleges, and then on to higher education. Funding is always an issue for further education colleges. They have big issues around hiring and retaining staff. And I think if we want to have a gold standard of technical and vocational education, and we're expecting them also to pick up resits of maths and English, then they require funding to be able to deliver fair pay deal for their staff. And if you want industry experts to be able to teach things like T levels and those more hands-on qualifications where you want them to have had industry expertise and you want to draw them back out of the workplace into college, then I think accordingly the salary needs to match. Otherwise, if you're working in an engineering firm, what would be the attraction apart from the altruistic element of coming into a further education college to deliver that real direct and exciting learning that young people really like? So there's the workforce, there's the fact that if you want to be able to teach technical and vocational qualifications in a manner that is engaging and will last beyond the student's life in the college, then there is pressure always on having the newest equipment so that you can make sure that young people are going into the workplace understanding the latest technology that is being used. And for most colleges that is a challenge all the time, and some colleges have been really clever about how they share that between a number of colleges, so that one is specialising in perhaps engineering and another specialises in construction, but the pressure is on all the time to be able to keep up with the evolution of what's happening in the sector. So I think workforce is really important, and I think a strategy of what FE is there for, what it's designed for, what we want from it, because it's a catch-all, and then it's sort of under a lot of pressure to deliver on so many different things. So you've got colleges that are delivering English as a second language, you've got maths and English retakes, you've got BTECs, you've got your T levels, some are providing HE provision, some are providing a community hub element to it. We do expect a lot from HE, and we fund it the least.
So I'll echo some of Alice's points around workforce. I think the challenges, we hear a lot about the challenges of workforce in primary and secondary schools, and yet vacancy rates in FE are around 10 times those in schools, particularly challenging in areas such as construction, engineering, sort of basic digital maths and English. We also know, relatedly from the IFS, that school teachers are paid around 18% more than teachers in colleges. So clearly there are going to be recruitment and retention. And I think this will have an impact on students and student outcomes. Research from a few years, from 2018, suggested that around a quarter of basic literacy and numeracy teachers were unqualified to teach at level 2 or above. I mean, that's quite a shocking finding, and I don't think it's one that we would necessarily accept in schools in the primary or secondary phase. And I do think a lot, it's easy to always come back to funding, but actually some of the funding differences are so stark. 16 to 19 funding is down around 11% since its 2010 peak, whereas schools back at its 2010 peak. So the phase has definitely fallen behind. And as I mentioned previously, I think it's disadvantaged learners that actually are probably hardest hit by this, with them seeing the greatest fall in funding between the ages of 16 in secondary school and then the 16 to 19 phase.
Thank you.
So I won't repeat the figures around funding because we would echo those. One thing I think is probably worth mentioning is that we're working with colleges to develop appropriate training for individuals who come from industry. It's an industry associates program, so what is it like for somebody who is moving from industry into FE teaching? Possibly not full-time to start with, actually. And what sort of training do we need to have that's appropriate for them if they're not stepping straight into full-time teaching, which is quite a change to move from industry into full-time teaching. We think that is an area that deserves a lot more attention.
Thank you. And for our final question, Jess.
Yes, final question is because to merge it and for time. So could you tell us some of the wider pressures currently facing the further education sector And if this committee were to conduct a broader inquiry into FE, including looking at funding, skills and the curriculum, which issues should we explore and why?
Shall I go first?
Yes,
okay. A few people mentioned resits. I would definitely echo that. And I think resits and perhaps more broadly numeracy and literacy for the phase, and maybe even extending that into curriculum breadth. I think Alice has made some good points around whether we need to be moving in the longer term to a more of a baccalaureate system. I hesitate a little bit in saying that because I think there's been constant reform for the FE sector, and that obviously would be a very significant one, and they would need to be highly supported to enable them to deliver on that. So resits, curriculum breadth and workforce, which I mentioned previously.
So workforce certainly would be on my list. I think we haven't mentioned today looking at essential skills, and I think that's an area that gets talked about a lot under various banners, employability, work readiness, but there are proven and evaluated approaches to embedding essential skills, and I think that would be something for any future work on curriculum to look at. I think it's also, I just want to just revisit the importance of not only looking at level 3, I think Kath mentioned that earlier, particularly interested in the area around level 1 and below. We looked at a report from DFE in 2017, 49,000 16-year-olds without GCSE passes at A-star to C, who studied entry or level 1. 38% progressed to an apprenticeship or level 2 the following year. But the really key thing is that at institutional level, that range went from 75% to 7%. So what that suggests is that whilst there's obviously some prior attainment would account for some of that, it's not for everything. So that is an area that deserves as much oversight so that each and every student is getting the same level of oversight of their qualification as level 3.
I would echo resits and the workforce. I think also I think it's really important to protect apprenticeship opportunities for young people under the new growth and skills levy. The Edge Foundation's done a really good piece of work, I would say that, called Flex Without Compromise, but well worth having a look at. It's really important that we continue to, if we're going to allow flex within the levy, that we continue to make sure that we focus on young people's opportunity between the ages of 16 and 24 to be able to enter the workplace by an apprenticeship. I think moving forward, it'd be really interesting to understand Skills England's role and how that is going to link with the discussion that we've had today. So perhaps this committee might be able to look into an accountability hearing on the newly established body. I think it would be really interesting to understand how that all slots together. And then I think a vision for 16 to 19 education, so including those academic, technical and vocational pathways, and thinking about it much more holistically. And then trying to join the education from 4 all the way through up, so it becomes much less siloed, so that we can see how young people progress through each and every stage, so that we can pick up those that are struggling or falling behind before it becomes too late. And actually a lot of the problems we talked about today, we could fix earlier in the journey, and then we wouldn't be facing the same sort of issues post-16.
Thank you very much. That brings our evidence session for today to an end. Can I thank all of our witnesses and members as well for your questions. Thank you.